the nativity scene is at the center of the Christmas story. I mean, do you have one or two or maybe more, as part of all of your different Christmas decorations? And at the very, very, very center of every nativity is, well, baby Jesus. I mean, we get that because he is the reason for the season. And if your nativity is like mine, Jesus is laying in a wooden manger. It looks like a wooden, well, let's use a modern word, crib. But actually the word manger is best translated as feeding trough. And a feeding trough some 2,000 years ago would have been made out of stone, not wood. Protecting Jesus is a barn-like wood structure. But again, what we do know is, well, some 2,000 years ago in that part of the region, they didn't have a bunch of trees where they could actually have dimensional lumber to build buildings with. They had a plethora of olive trees, but olive trees are not good at building structures. I mean, I have a nativity set made out of olive wood, and it's beautiful. But again, not for building things. More likely, Jesus would have been born in a cave-like structure. In all nativities, there's Mary and Joseph on each side of Jesus, and Mary and Joseph, right, living in Nazareth, and they start making their way to Jerusalem. And they end up in Bethlehem because there's no room at the inn, but they traveled a long distance, a difficult distance, a dangerous distance to get there, to find a place, and for Mary to give birth. In most nativities, there's animals like donkeys and oxen, but we don't really know if there were donkeys and oxen and other animals there. I mean, we assume there are, but the gospel writers don't tell us for sure what animals were there or not there. But they probably were. A lot of people think that actually Mary rode a donkey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. But again, we don't know whether she rode a donkey or not. I mean, maybe she did, but donkeys were kind of a luxury item, and Mary and Joseph were poor. There's many scholars, that actually believe that they would have traveled in a really large caravan of people making their way to Jerusalem. Why? There was safety in numbers. And even some historians would have said, if anything, Mary would have been placed in a basket strapped to a camel. I mean, if she rode anything, that's probably what she would have done. But again, we don't know. Luke tells us that one night the shepherds were in the fields, and all of a sudden an angel shows up and lets them know, hey, something seismic is happening right now. God is on the move. The Messiah is coming, and you want to go see. And well, I have one shepherd, part of my nativity set, but there's many, many more than just one shepherd, because shepherds would work together. For the same reason, people would travel together. There's safety in numbers. And so the shepherds made their way to find the Messiah, Jesus. And, we don't know if they brought their sheep with them or not. I mean, maybe they did, or maybe they picked a couple of their favorites, or maybe they left all the sheep with one person to watch all of them. We don't know, but maybe they brought their sheep. And then Matthew tells us a star appears, the star to mark, to signify the fact that, where Jesus was. And this star is what the Magi, these pagan Persian astrologers, magicians that traveled from afar. Now, they weren't there the first night or the first week or the first month. I mean, it probably took them a year or more to travel that distance. And, there's probably more than just three. I mean, we know there was three gifts, but they would have traveled in a caravan of hundreds and hundreds, because these Persian pagan astrologers were kingmakers. They're the elite of all the elite. And they did show up to honor, to worship a baby king. And I think about the nativity, and where we know some details, and over the years, some details have been kind of, just assumed to be part of the story. At the very epicenter of the story is Jesus. I mean, that's what the story is all about. That God became an infant. That God invaded this dark world with a plan for all people. But you see, do you know who the first person ever mentioned in connection with the Christmas story is? Do you know the first person? Well, most of our nativities won't even include this person. But the first person in connection to the Christmas story is a guy named Zechariah. And Zechariah was, he was married to Elizabeth. And Luke tells us two such incredible insights, kind of descriptions of their character. He tells us that Zechariah and Elizabeth were, one, righteous. And that word means right before God. I mean, it has everything to do with not what other people thought about them, but what God thought about them. And that's the thing that God over and over came to. Like, God sees the heart. He sees our soul. That's what God's looking for. Not the outward appearance, but he wants to know what's going on inside. And Luke says, hey, they were righteous before God in the sight of God. How God viewed them, that they were a husband, a wife, a man, a woman of trust, of faith, in pursuit in the relationship with God. And that they were blameless, free of guilt. Now, blameless does not mean they were perfect. They were not perfect. Blameless does not mean that they didn't have some spiritual wondering and wanderings. Blameless doesn't mean that they never sinned, they never made mistakes, that they didn't have little dark corners within their heart. That's not what blameless means. What blameless means that they were free of guilt. Why? Because they were righteous in the sight of God, that they had trusted and put their faith. They were pursuing a relationship with God, and because of that, His grace wrapped around them. They were blameless, not because what they did or didn't do. They were blameless because who they followed, who they placed their faith in. And then Luke writes the word but. And right there, he goes, but. And you can just feel the whole story go, oh, you just said two incredible things about Zechariah and Elizabeth, and then you wrote the word but. It's like Christmas morning if you're unwrapping presents and you look at your spouse and you say to your spouse, oh, this is the best Christmas gift ever. But, can you imagine your spouses look back at you in that moment? Or it'd be like after a Christmas dinner, you look over the table to the very end of the table where your mother-in-law is sitting, and you say in front of everyone as you look at your mother-in-law in the eyes, you're like, you make the best pecan pie. But it just shifts the whole statement. It's like Luke is telling us about Zechariah and Elizabeth being righteous and blameless, and then he writes, but they were childless. As a husband and wife, they didn't have kids. And in fact, Elizabeth was infertile. I mean, she couldn't have a child. And they were old. Their dreams of having a family, gone. Their dreams of having a child, call them mom and dad, gone. Their dreams of raising kids together. I mean, all of that. And if you've ever been through a season like that, my wife and I, early on in marriage, we went a pretty lengthy time desiring to have kids and just couldn't. It was difficult. The longing, the desire, and you can't. And for Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were old in age. And they had just given up the reality that they would ever have a family for themselves. And Zechariah was a priest, and that was his job. And for all the priests, and there were some 18,000 plus priests during this period of time, and Zechariah was one of them. And well, every year, in fact, 2 times a year, every priest would have to go spend a week serving at the temple. And kind of at the pinnacle moment of being a priest is if you actually got selected to go inside the temple and light the incense. I mean, that was the pinnacle moment for every priest. And the only way you could do that is to be selected. And at the most, you could be selected once in your lifetime. Why? Because there's so many priests. And Zechariah, as an old man, had never been selected, but on that day, he was. Got selected to go in as an old man. And could you imagine him walking in to the temple going, at least I got chosen. At least in my lifetime, I'm able to worship God in this way, to light the incense for all the people. So he went in. And Luke tells us that when he was in there, that Gabriel, an angel, appears. Now, not an angel with like wings attached to them. Don't think of that. In fact, the Old Testament prophet Daniel, I had an encounter with Gabriel, and he described Gabriel as a man. So Gabriel, this man figure, all of a sudden just emerges right next to the table where the incense was burned. And Zechariah was gripped with fear, and Gabriel looks back at Zechariah and was like, hey, don't be afraid. And Zechariah's like, yeah, right. And Gabriel says to Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Oh. I wonder if Zechariah's mind just went like in triple speed, trying to think about what prayer. Out of all the things he had prayed for. I mean, he's an old man. He had prayed for a lot of things over the decades. I could imagine him just thinking through what prayer. But I don't think he ever thought about this prayer. And Gabriel said, you're going to have a son. And you're to name that son John. Zechariah's mind had to just freeze. How many times had he prayed for a child? How many times had he and Elizabeth begged God for a child? How many times had they tried to barter with God for a child? You know, bartering with God? When you say, hey, God, if you, I will. Or maybe you reverse it, hey, God, I will you please? Right? We barter. I know I have bartered with God. I just think about the number of conversations. I think for Zechariah and Elizabeth, they had just given up on that prayer because they were old. And Gabriel's like, you're going to have a son, but he's not going to be any ordinary son. Oh, Zechariah, it gets so much better that this son of yours, he's going to go before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Out of all the Old Testament prophets, Elijah was, in that upper echelon circle of prophets. And Gabriel's like, hey, just so you know, he's not going to be like any ordinary prophet. No, he's going to go like the spirit of Elijah and the power of Elijah. And, oh, by the way, Zechariah, again, it gets better, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. That he's a promised one to come before the Messiah, to let everyone know that the Messiah is here. How does Zechariah respond? Doubt just envelops him. Unbelief just completely wraps its tentacles around him. He's like, how can I be sure of this, is his question, his response. And Gabriel looks at Zechariah and says, I'm here because God has sent me here to give you this good news, to give you this message. And because of your doubt, because of your unbelief, you will now be silent. And Zechariah couldn't talk. Zechariah had to leave the temple. I mean, thousands of people were outside, and when he came out, he couldn't speak to them at all. He made his way home to his wife, Elizabeth, and he had to try to describe without talking. He had to write down like what just took place and why he couldn't talk, but what Gabriel had said to them, that they were going to have a son to name him John. And there he waited. But Gabriel wasn't done yet. He had another message, and so he showed up to Mary to let Mary know, hey, what God was on the move doing and how she was going to play a part in that storyline. And I think about how Zechariah and Mary both responded to Gabriel. Again, Zechariah's response was full of doubt and unbelief. He was like, how can I be sure of this? I can't believe this. But Mary responded in a vastly different way. She responded by saying, how will this be? Her response, her question was like, oh, okay, I trust that this is happening. I just want to know how practically this is going to happen. Mary was just a little bit caught of like, I'm a virgin and I'm not married yet, so how will this be? Mary's question was practical. Zechariah's question was filled with doubt and unbelief. And that's where Zechariah sat, in silence, waiting, not knowing how long he would be silent. The day came, his wife gave birth to a boy, and family and friends had traveled in. It was time to name him, and the family and friends just assumed that they were going to name him Zechariah. Why? Because in that culture, that's what you did. You named the oldest boy after the dad. And so they just assumed that. But Elizabeth's like, no, we're going to name him John. And they literally turned their back on Elizabeth to look at Zechariah. And Zechariah waved for a writing tablet so he could write down. And he wrote down on this writing tablet, his name is John. And in that moment, God opened his mouth and he began to speak. And Zechariah said, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has delivered them. He has raised up a horn. This was an image of a king, a mighty victory, a king of power. He's raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. They all knew that God's promised Messiah would come from the lineage of King David. And then Luke adds this like little insight. It's like a reminder. He puts it in parentheses. He goes, remember, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago. Luke's like, hey, just remember, God's storyline, God's story arc, this has been part of God's plan for hundreds, thousands of years. Hey, just remember, God's been speaking through his prophets, pointing to this moment. And Zechariah goes on, he goes, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy, compassion to our ancestors, and to remember his holy covenant. God's covenant. What God brings to the relationship and what God desires for you, for me, to bring to the relationship. His covenant relationship. The oath, that's his promise. He swore to our father Abraham. Remember that God is who he says he is, and that God will do everything that he says he's going to do. Maybe not in our timing, maybe not in ways that we anticipate him doing it, but God is faithful and he will always deliver on his promises. Zechariah says, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies, and to enable us to serve him without fear. Jewish rabbis believed that you would serve God either out of love or out of fear. And Zechariah says, let's serve God without fear. Meaning, let's serve him out of the overflow of love in our heart for him and his love for us. In holiness and righteousness before him all of our days. And then Zechariah looks down at his son. And he says this, he goes, and you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High. Now this would have been a deafening statement to all around. You see, for the Jewish people, they had been in this period of 400 years of silence. I mean, God had not spoken through a prophet in 400 years. And all of a sudden, Zechariah says to his son, you are a prophet of the Most High God. It would have gotten everyone's attention. I mean, this moment. And he goes on, he goes, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him. He's the one that God has promised to be the precursor to the Messiah, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins. And then he turns back out of his son, and he's talking about Jesus. He goes, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven. And he ends with this: to shine on those living in darkness, in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. You see, I think about what Zechariah said right at the end. To shine in the darkness and to guide our feet in the path of peace. This is the Christmas story. At the heart of the nativity scene, that Jesus invaded the darkness of this world to illuminate the darkness. And that when you put your faith and trust in Jesus, now you become light carriers. Do you realize that? That when you place your faith and trust in Jesus, you now carry the light, which is Him, that shines in the darkest corners of our world. It is the image of the church, a gathering of imperfect people. I mean, that's why I love the story of Zechariah. All that doubt, all that unbelief, and God still used him in such a powerful way to speak words that are timeless. That Jesus came to shine. That we, the church, are the carriers of His light and to guide us the path of peace. You see, I don't know what you're facing right now in life. I don't know the unknown that is wreaking havoc with the anxiety within you right now as you look forward. Maybe it's a season of just sorrow as you've lost a loved one. Maybe for you, you're longing to have a child call you mom or dad, and you're just, right now it's not happening, and you're begging, you're praying, you're maybe even bargaining with God. Maybe right now it's a season of just financial stress as you just don't know what tomorrow and the next week and 2024 is going to look like. Maybe for you right now, your path is filled with just relational hurt and brokenness. Maybe for you as a mom or dad, you've been hurt by a child and you're just trying to figure out how to heal that relationship, and you have no idea looking forward what that's going to look like. Maybe for you right now, you're lonely. You see, that's why following in the steps of Jesus, as He guides us in the path of peace, it doesn't mean that all that stuff just disappears. It means that in the midst of all of it, His peace settles in. You see, that's my heart for you. That's my prayer for you. Is that you experience that type of peace. That as you follow in the footsteps of Jesus, you experience His comfort, His mercy, His love, His grace, His peace. And as you follow Him, realize He wants to use you and your story to illuminate, to shine in this dark world. You see, God desires for you to carry the light of Jesus. And as you go, not only for you to experience His peace, but you to share with others about a peace that's beyond this world. You see, this is what the Christmas story is all about. Let's pray. Lord, we celebrate You for a gift in the form of a child that's beyond our comprehension. For Your Son, Jesus, to come into this world as a child, as an infant, with a plan to give His life for all people. And for You to place into imperfect, broken, messy people like me into our hands. His light to illuminate this world. Lord, I just pray that on this Christmas, as we look at a nativity, that we'll not miss your perfect plan through your Son Jesus, placed in imperfect hands like ours to illuminate this dark world. In your name I pray.